Halloween, a night of costumes, tricks, and celebrations, a time when we enjoy being scared, knowing deep down that the darkness is pretend, or is it? For some, Halloween stories don't remain in the realm of imagination. Beneath the masks and decorations, not everything is as innocent as it seems. Prepare yourself, because today we dive into 13 tales so terrifying, they'll send chills down your spine. This is not for the faint of heart. You've been warned. Our first story takes place in a neighborhood that whispered of an abandoned house said to be cursed. A group of teenage friends, emboldened by the thrills of Halloween, decided to challenge the legend. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they ventured into the decaying home. Dust blanketed the furniture and cobwebs hung like curtains across the rooms. But it was in the basement that they found something chilling. Candles, freshly lit, arranged in a circle. As one of them, laughing nervously, tried to blow the candles out, a shadow crept up the walls, twisting and moving like it had a mind of its own. The air grew ice cold, and one of the boys let out a blood-curdling scream. He shouted, "Something's pulling me!" Terrified, the group fled the house, except for one. When the others returned with the police, the friend was nowhere to be found. To this day, no trace of him has ever been discovered. Our second tale follows a young woman walking home from Halloween festivities. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't initially notice the man in a mask following her. With every turn she took, he stayed behind her, always keeping just enough distance. But when she hastened her pace, she realized something odd. He wasn't walking. He was completely still, just staring. When she finally made it home, her heart pounded as she slammed the door and locked it. Feeling relief wash over her, she glanced out the window. The masked man was gone. But as she turned toward the hallway, she let out a gasp. Reflected in the mirror by the stairs was his mask inside the house. The third story begins with a boy who donned an old clown costume for Halloween. The outfit, his mother said, had been handed down from a relative. But there was something deeply unsettling about it. The fabric smelled of mildew, and the mask, those piercing eyes, looked far too real. That night, the boy swore he wasn't alone in his room. Soft snickers seemed to echo around him. At first, he thought his family was playing a prank, but when he looked in the mirror, he froze. The mask wasn't a mask anymore. It had fused to his face, the painted grin now carved into his own skin. In a quiet suburban area, an elderly woman was known for handing out homemade candy on Halloween. Children adored her treats until one boy noticed something odd. Deep inside the candy, glinting under the light, was a tiny human tooth. Horrified, his parents alerted the police. When authorities searched the woman's home, they were met with a nightmare. A locked basement filled with dolls stitched from human skin. The candy had been a facade to hide something much darker. A Ouija board seemed like harmless fun to impress friends on Halloween night, but for one boy, it was anything but a game. Laughing, his friends asked the spirits to give them a sign. The planchette moved on its own, spelling out, "I am behind you." Uneasy silence filled the room, but they assumed someone was joking until they saw it. A shadowy figure loomed over the boy in the mirror. The next day, the boy's desk at school was empty. He was missing, and no one ever saw him again. In our sixth tale, a group of skeptics ventured into an old cemetery to challenge a local legend. It was said that lighting a black candle on graves summoned the spirit beneath. They picked a tomb at random, and laughing, lit the candle. A gust of wind extinguished their flashlights, and eerie whispers filled the air. Panic set in when they noticed a disturbed grave nearby and a hand emerging from the earth. They escaped, most of them anyway. The next morning, the missing boy's name was etched into the tombstone they had chosen. Halloween isn't complete without trick-or-treating, but one young girl discovered more than she bargained for. Outside a decrepit house, she found an antique doll lying on the porch. Intrigued by its charm, she brought it home. That night, she woke up feeling as though eyes were on her. Turning on the light, she immediately screamed. The doll wasn't on her shelf anymore. It was sitting at the foot of her bed, its painted grin now impossibly wide. The next tale takes us to the isolated home of a man who thought Halloween was silly superstition. That is, until he found a note on his porch reading, "You're next!" Chuckling at what he thought was a joke, he tossed it aside. But that night his phone rang. The distorted voice on the other end whispered his name. He hung up, only for the voice to echo around his room, even without the phone. Looking outside, he saw masked figures staring at him from the shadows. By morning, his reflection in the mirror wore a mask he had never seen before, and he could no longer take it off. A group of friends decided to hike in a forest famous for Halloween disappearances. Deep in the woods, they stumbled upon an old mansion and walked inside. What they found was impossible. Framed photographs of each of them, taken from that very night. One by one, the friends vanished. The last survivor turned to run, only to see his own face in a final photo appear before his eyes, smiling wickedly. Curious, he played it. The recording showed grainy footage of a person sleeping. It didn't take long for him to realize it was himself. In the video, a shadow loomed at the foot of his bed. Terrified, he pressed stop and bolted toward his locked bedroom. But the door was ajar. Someone or something had been watching. A cryptic text message marked the beginning of our 11th tale. A young woman received just 5 words: "Do not wear that costume." Assuming it was a prank, she shrugged it off and left for a Halloween party. Unsettlingly, many attendees wore identical costumes. At first, it amused her until their faces started to warp. Smiles stretched unnaturally and their hollow eyes fixed on her. By the end of the night, she was the only person left who looked human. The next morning, only her costume remained, abandoned on the street, and she was never seen again. Urban explorers often seek thrills, but few return with stories like this one. A team decided to spend Halloween night in a derelict hospital that had once housed dangerous patients. Among peeling walls and rusted equipment, they found a room with an unmade bed. From the shadows, a woman's voice murmured incomprehensibly. As their flashlights flickered, a faceless figure emerged, clad in a white gown, pointing. The explorers' cameras were all that remained, their chilling footage circulating online, but they were never heard from again. Finally, the 13th story brings us to a man drawn to a peculiar antique shop. In the dusty corner, he found a mask that the shopkeeper refused to sell. "It doesn't belong to you," the owner warned. Ignoring him, the man stole it and took it home. That night, plagued by nightmares, he woke to find the mask fused to his face. Desperate, he clawed at it, but it wouldn't budge. Looking in the mirror, his reflection was no longer human. The mask had become his new identity. And there you have it, 13 tales of terror that remind us Halloween isn't always just fun and games. They say the veil between worlds grows thinner on this night, so double-check the locks, listen closely to the silence, and if you sense someone watching you, don't look back. It might already be too late.